My entitled daughter-in-law demanded my Tuscan villa, so I gave it to her, along with a bill that left her completely shattered. The champagne flutes clinked against each other as my daughter-in-law raised her glass, her perfectly manicured nails catching the Mediterranean sunlight, streaming through the villa's floor-to-ceiling windows. What should have been a celebration of my grandson's first birthday had just taken a turn that would change everything between us forever. "To Alessandro's future," Victoria announced, her voice carrying that familiar tone of entitlement I'd grown to recognize over the past 3 years. "And to the villa that will secure it." I smiled politely, sipping my champagne, while my son, Marco, beamed proudly at his wife. The terracotta tiles beneath my feet had been laid by my own hands 40 years ago, when this place was nothing more than a crumbling stone foundation overlooking the Tuscan countryside. Every archway, every hand-painted fresco, every olive tree in the grove below represented decades of my life's work. But Victoria saw something different when she looked around. She saw opportunity. After the other guests had departed and little Alessandro was napping peacefully in his crib, Victoria cornered me on the vine-covered terrace where I'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset paint the hills golden. "Roberto, we need to discuss something important." Her English accent made everything sound like a royal decree. "Marco and I have been talking, and we've reached a decision about the villa." I set down my espresso cup, the ceramic making a soft click against the wrought iron table I'd commissioned from a local artisan 20 years earlier. "What kind of decision?" She smoothed her designer dress and sat across from me, her posture rigid with determination. "We want you to transfer the deed to us, for Alessandro's sake, of course. The inheritance taxes in Italy are absolutely brutal, and if something happened to you, well..." She let the words hang in the air like smoke from the kitchen hearth. The audacity took my breath away. This woman, who'd married my son 2 years ago and immediately began cataloging everything we owned, was now demanding I hand over my life's greatest achievement. "Victoria, this villa has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather was a peasant farmer," she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Times have changed, Roberto. Alessandro needs security, not sentiment. Marco agrees with me completely." I glanced toward the kitchen where my son was cleaning dishes, his shoulders tense with the kind of stress that comes from being caught between loyalty to his wife and respect for his father. When had he become so passive, so willing to let Victoria make decisions that should be ours to discuss as a family? "Besides," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that calculating edge I'd learned to dread, "you're getting older. Maintaining this place must be exhausting. Wouldn't it be easier to live somewhere smaller, more manageable? We could find you a lovely little apartment in the village." A lovely little apartment. After 40 years of building something magnificent from nothing, she wanted to shuffle me off to some cramped space while she played Lady of the Manor in my home. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after a long day of hosting. The view from the terrace stretched across rolling hills dotted with cypress trees, vineyards that had fed my family for decades, and the medieval tower of San Gimignano rising in the distance. This wasn't just property to me. This was legacy, heritage, the physical manifestation of everything I'd sacrificed to build a better life for my family. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, though my mind was already racing with possibilities she couldn't imagine. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Don't think too long, Roberto. The sooner we handle this transition, the better for everyone involved." That night, after Marco and Victoria had retired to the guest wing with little Alessandro, I sat alone in my study surrounded by 40 years of memories. Photo albums showed the villa's transformation from ruin to paradise. Construction receipts documented every euro spent bringing my vision to life. Legal documents proved my ownership beyond any doubt. But scattered among these treasures were newer additions that told a different story. Credit card statements showing Victoria's shopping sprees in Florence and Rome. Bank transfers I'd made to cover their mortgage when Marco's architecture firm struggled during the pandemic. Bills for Alessandro's private nursery school that somehow became my responsibility to pay. The pattern was clear now, viewed through the lens of this afternoon's demand. Victoria hadn't married my son for love. She'd married him for access to wealth she assumed was hers by right. My generosity over the past 2 years had been interpreted as weakness, my desire to help my family seen as obligation rather than choice. I opened my laptop and began researching Italian property law, inheritance regulations, and tax implications. If Victoria wanted to play games with my legacy, she'd discover that her opponent had been navigating these complexities longer than she'd been alive. The next morning brought clarity along with the sunrise. I'd made my decision, but Victoria and Marco wouldn't learn about it until the perfect moment presented itself. For now, I'd let them believe their manipulation was working. "Good morning, Roberto," Victoria chirped as she descended the marble staircase, designer athleisure outfit perfectly coordinated for her morning yoga session by the pool. "Have you given more thought to our conversation yesterday?" I poured myself coffee from the mocha pot, savoring the rich aroma that always reminded me of my late wife Isabella. She'd have known exactly how to handle Victoria's grasping ambitions. "Some consideration, yes. These matters require careful planning." Victoria's eyes lit up with premature victory. "Wonderful. I've already contacted a lawyer in Florence who specializes in property transfers. She can meet with us next week to begin the paperwork." The presumption was breathtaking. She'd arranged legal counsel before I'd even agreed to her demands, already spending money she didn't have on a transaction that existed only in her imagination. "That seems premature," I said mildly, watching her expression shift from confidence to irritation. "Roberto, we discussed this. Delaying only creates complications. The tax advantages will still exist next month or next year." I met her gaze steadily. "This is my home, Victoria. Surely I'm entitled to consider all options before making such a significant decision." Marco appeared in the kitchen doorway. Alessandro balanced on his hip, both of them looking uncomfortable with the tension crackling between Victoria and me. "Papa, maybe we should all sit down together and discuss this properly," he said, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone he'd perfected during years of mediating between his wife and his father. Victoria's smile could have frozen the Mediterranean in July. "Of course, darling. Family decisions should involve the whole family." She emphasized the word family like it was a weapon, reminding me that I was outnumbered in my own home. But she'd made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed that age had made me weak, that grief over Isabella's death had left me vulnerable, that my love for my grandson would override my judgment about his grasping mother. She was about to discover just how wrong she could be. Over the following days, I played the role of the conflicted patriarch, asking thoughtful questions about their plans for the villa while secretly documenting every assumption they made, every demand they presented, every indication that they saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a father to be respected. Victoria's mask slipped further each day. She began rearranging furniture without asking, making plans for renovations that would erase Isabella's careful decorating choices, even discussing which rooms would become her home office and workout studio. "The master suite has the best view," she mentioned casually over dinner one evening. "Once we take over the villa, that will obviously become our bedroom." My bedroom, where Isabella and I had shared 43 years of marriage, where she'd taken her final breath holding my hand, was just another asset to be claimed in Victoria's grand acquisition. That night, I made several phone calls to old friends in Florence, Rome, and Milan. Lawyers, accountants, business associates who'd helped me navigate Italy's complex bureaucracy during my years building the construction company that funded this villa's restoration. By morning, I had everything I needed for the surprise that would teach Victoria an unforgettable lesson about assuming she could manipulate a man who'd survived 6 decades of life's hardest challenges. The confrontation would come soon, but not yet. First, I needed to complete the preparations that would ensure Victoria got exactly what she had demanded, in ways she'd never imagined possible. The week that followed felt like preparing for battle, though Victoria remained blissfully unaware that war had been declared. She continued her campaign of assumption and entitlement, each day bringing new evidence of how thoroughly she'd planned to take control of my life's work. I found her in Isabella's garden on Wednesday morning, pulling up the lavender bushes my wife had planted the year before her death. The purple flowers lay scattered across the stone pathway like casualties of Victoria's vision for modernization. "These old plants are so overgrown," she said without looking up, dirt smudged on her yoga pants. "I'm thinking we'll put in something more contemporary. Maybe some of those architectural grasses you see in design magazines." My hands clenched into fists as I watched her destroy Isabella's final gift to this place. Those lavender plants had been carefully chosen for their ability to thrive in Tuscan soil, their fragrance designed to complement the wild herbs that grew naturally on the hillsides surrounding us. "Isabella planted those herself," I said quietly. Victoria paused, her expression showing the briefest flicker of something that might have been shame before her usual entitlement reasserted itself. I'm sure she did lovely work for her time, but tastes evolve. Alessandro will grow up with a more sophisticated aesthetic sense. Sophisticated. As if my wife's connection to this land, her understanding of what belonged here, was somehow primitive compared to whatever Victoria had absorbed from glossy magazines and expensive interior designers. That afternoon, while Victoria took Alessandro to the village for gelato, I met with Giuliano Rossi in his law office overlooking the Piazza della Cisterna. Giuliano had been handling my legal affairs for 25 years, ever since I'd first purchased the villa's ruins and needed help navigating the labyrinth of permits required for restoration. "Roberto, my friend," he said, pouring us both glasses of his family's Chianti, "this is quite an unusual request. Are you certain this is the path you wish to take?" I spread the documents across his antique desk, each page representing a different aspect of the plan I'd been developing. Bank statements, property valuations, tax assessments, legal precedents from similar cases across Italy. Victoria believes she understands Italian law better than someone who's lived here for 40 years, I replied. She's about to receive an education in the consequences of her assumptions. Giuliano reviewed each document with the methodical precision that had made him one of Tuscany's most respected attorneys. His bushy eyebrows rose higher with each page, and by the time he'd finished reading, he was chuckling despite the serious nature of our business. "You realize this will create quite a scandal in the family," he warned. "The scandal began when my daughter-in-law decided to treat me like a senile old man whose only value was signing papers she put in front of me." I leaned back in the leather chair, feeling more energized than I had in months. "She wants the deed to my villa? She'll get exactly what she's asking for." We spent 2 hours reviewing every detail, ensuring that every aspect of my plan was legally sound and properly documented. Giuliano's staff prepared multiple copies of each document, official seals gleaming red against the cream-colored paper. "When do you intend to execute this?" Giuliano asked as we shook hands in his office doorway. "This weekend. Victoria has been pushing for a family meeting to finalize the transfer. She'll get her meeting, but not the outcome she's expecting." The drive back to the villa took me through vineyards heavy with grapes nearly ready for harvest. Farmers moved between the rows, their faces weathered by decades of sun and honest work. These were my people, descendants of families who'd worked this land for generations, who understood that true wealth came from connection to place rather than mere ownership of property. Victoria understood none of this. To her, the villa was simply an asset to be acquired, its value measured in euros rather than memories, its worth calculated by what it could provide rather than what it represented. That evening, Marco approached me on the terrace where I was watching the sunset paint the cypress trees gold against the darkening sky. Alessandro toddled between us, his chubby hands grasping at fireflies, beginning their nightly dance above the olive grove. "Papa, Victoria says you've agreed to the transfer," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "Is this really what you want?" I studied my son's face, searching for traces of the boy who used to help me plant trees and repair stone walls, who'd understood the difference between building something meaningful and merely accumulating possessions. "What do you want, Marco? Not Victoria, not Alessandro's future prospects, not what makes financial sense. What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching his son chase shadows across the terracotta tiles. "I want Alessandro to know where he comes from. I want him to understand that this place has stories, that it means something beyond its market value." "And Victoria?" Marco's shoulders sagged with the weight of a truth he'd been avoiding. "Victoria sees dollar signs, Papa. Everything's about what things cost, what they're worth, what advantage they provide. Sometimes I wonder if she even notices the sunset." We sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the hills, fireflies blinking like scattered stars among Isabella's roses. Alessandro fell asleep in Marco's arms, his face peaceful in the way that only comes to those who feel completely safe. "The family meeting Victoria wants," I said finally. "I've agreed to it, Sunday afternoon, after lunch." Marco nodded, though I could see tension building in his jaw. "She's very confident about how it will go." "She should be. She's going to get exactly what she's been demanding." Something in my tone made Marco look at me sharply, but before he could ask questions, Victoria's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." She swept onto the terrace in a cloud of expensive perfume, her silk dress clearly chosen for maximum impact. "I hope you two weren't discussing business without me. After all, this affects our entire future." Our future? As if she'd contributed anything to building what she was now claiming as her inheritance. "Just enjoying the evening," I replied mildly. "Marco was telling me about Alessandro's development. He's walking so well now." Victoria's smile was sharp with satisfaction. "Yes, he's advanced for his age. Superior genetics, I suppose. Speaking of advancement, have you given more thought to the timeline for our property discussion? The lawyer I mentioned is available Monday morning." "Sunday will be fine," I said, rising from my chair. "We'll handle everything then." As I walked past her toward the villa's entrance, I caught the scent of lavender from the murdered plants she'd discarded behind the garden shed. Isabella's presence felt suddenly strong around me, as if she were offering her blessing for what was about to unfold. Victoria had no idea that Sunday's meeting would become the most expensive afternoon of her life, though not in ways she could possibly imagine. She'd demanded the deed to my villa, and she was going to receive it, along with everything that came attached to such a generous gift. The weekend passed with agonizing slowness, each hour bringing fresh evidence of Victoria's assumptions about her impending windfall. She made calls to interior designers, researched expensive renovations, even contacted a wine consultant about upgrading the villa's modest cellar to something worthy of her elevated tastes. "I'm thinking we'll need to expand the master suite," she mentioned over Saturday's breakfast, sketching rough plans on a napkin. "Maybe add a private terrace, definitely a larger closet. These old Italian houses never have adequate storage for a proper wardrobe." Marco shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Alessandro balanced on his knee, making happy babbling sounds as he played with a wooden toy I'd carved for him months earlier. "The villa is already quite large," Marco said carefully. "Maybe we should focus on preserving its character rather than changing everything." Victoria's laugh was crystalline and cold. "Darling, character doesn't increase property values. We need to think strategically about improvements that will enhance our investment." Investment? She'd reduced my life's greatest achievement to a financial instrument, something to be leveraged and optimized rather than cherished and protected. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, promising heat that would drive sensible people indoors during the afternoon hours. Perfect weather for the kind of family meeting that would be remembered for decades. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the charcoal gray one Isabella had helped me choose for our 40th wedding anniversary. If today was going to be memorable, I wanted to look the part of a man who understood the gravity of what he was about to do. Victoria appeared for lunch in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, her hair styled in the kind of elaborate arrangement that required professional assistance. She was dressed for victory, radiating the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won. "Such a beautiful day for important decisions," she said, air-kissing my cheeks with theatrical affection. "I have a good feeling about this afternoon." She had no idea how good her feelings were about to become, or how thoroughly she was going to regret having them. At precisely 2 o'clock, we gathered in the villa's formal dining room, the space where Isabella and I had hosted countless celebrations over the years. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the hand-painted frescoes that depicted scenes of Tuscan harvest festivals. Victoria sat across from me, her leather portfolio open to reveal pages of notes and calculations. Marco occupied the chair between us, looking like a man preparing for surgery. Alessandro played quietly in his portable crib, blissfully unaware that his future was being decided by the adults around him. "Well then," Victoria began, her voice bright with anticipation, "shall we discuss the transfer documents?" I smiled and reached for the manila envelope I'd placed beside my chair. "Actually, Victoria, I think we should start with something else. You've been very clear about wanting the deed to this villa, and I've decided to give you exactly what you're asking for." Her eyes lit up with triumph, but I wasn't finished speaking. "However, there are a few details we need to discuss first. Details about what comes along with owning property in Italy." I pulled the first document from the envelope, its official seals catching the afternoon light. Victoria leaned forward eagerly, her manicured fingers already reaching for the papers before I'd even set them on the polished mahogany table. "This," I said, sliding the deed across to her, "is what you've been asking for. The complete transfer of ownership for Villa San Lorenzo, including all structures, gardens, and the surrounding 15 hectares of land." Victoria's gasp of delight filled the room as she scanned the document, her eyes dancing over the legal terminology that confirmed her wildest dreams. Marco stared at the papers with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between relief and apprehension. "Roberto, this is incredibly generous," Victoria breathed, clutching the deed like it might evaporate if she loosened her grip. "Alessandro's future is completely secure now. Thank you so much for understanding how important this is for our family." "Oh, but we're not finished yet," I said pleasantly, reaching for the second document in my envelope. "You see, Victoria, when you own property in Italy, especially a property of this caliber, there are certain responsibilities that come with the privilege." Her smile flickered slightly, but she was still riding too high on victory to pay proper attention to the warning in my tone. I spread the second set of papers across the table, each page stamped with official government seals. "These are the property tax assessments for Villa San Lorenzo, calculated based on its current market value of 3.2 million euros. Victoria glanced at the numbers, then looked back at me with mild confusion. "Yes, of course there are property taxes. We expected that." "Did you?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly cordial. "Because according to Italian law, annual property taxes on a villa of this value come to approximately 48,000 euros per year. That's roughly 4,000 euros per month just for the privilege of ownership." The color began to drain from Victoria's face, but I continued before she could process the full implications. "Daro sceito. Then there's the mandatory insurance for a property of this historical significance," I said, pulling out the third document. "Since Villa San Lorenzo is registered as a cultural heritage site, the annual insurance premium is 36,000 euros. Non-negotiable, I'm afraid. The Italian government is quite strict about protecting historically significant architecture." Marco was staring at the papers now, his face growing pale as he began to understand what I was revealing. "Of course," I continued conversationally, "there's also the matter of maintenance. You've seen how beautiful the villa is, Victoria, but perhaps you haven't considered what it takes to keep it that way. The roof tiles alone require replacement every 15 years at a cost of approximately 80,000 euros. The frescoes need professional restoration every decade, another 60,000 euros. The heating system, the plumbing, the electrical work in a building this old—" I pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal decades of maintenance records, each receipt carefully preserved and organized by date. "On average, maintaining Villa San Lorenzo costs 120,000 euros annually. Some years less, some years considerably more. Last year, for instance, we had to repair foundation damage from the winter rains. That particular project cost 145,000 euros. Victoria's hands were trembling now as she reached for the maintenance records, her eyes scanning the endless list of expenses that came with owning something truly magnificent. "But surely," she said, her voice higher than usual, "surely the rental income from the villa would cover these costs. Properties like this can command premium rates from tourists." I nodded thoughtfully. "An excellent point. The villa could indeed generate rental income. However, there are a few complications with that plan." I produced another document, this one bearing the seal of the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage. "Since Villa San Lorenzo is classified as a protected cultural site, any commercial use requires special permits from 3 different government agencies. The application process typically takes 18 months, costs approximately 25,000 euros in fees, and has a success rate of roughly 30%. Victoria stared at the document as if it were written in ancient hieroglyphics. "Furthermore," I continued, "if commercial permits are granted, the property must be inspected monthly by heritage officials to ensure no damage is occurring to the historical elements. Each inspection costs 800 euros and must be scheduled at least 6 weeks in advance. Any violation of heritage protection guidelines results in immediate suspension of commercial permits and fines starting at 50,000 euros. The silence in the room was deafening. Alessandro had stopped playing with his toys and was looking around at the adults with the solemn expression children get when they sense tension they don't understand. "There's more," I said gently, pulling out the final set of documents. "As the new owner, you'll also be responsible for the ongoing obligations I've maintained with the local community. The olive grove, for instance, has been leased to the Benedetti family for 37 years. Their contract runs for another 15 years at 200 euros per month, well below market rate, but legally binding." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "The same applies to the vineyard on the eastern slope," I continued. "The Rossi family has a 20-year lease that renews automatically every 5 years. They pay €300 monthly, which barely covers the cost of maintaining the irrigation system. Marco finally found his voice. Papa, what are you saying exactly? I smiled at my son, feeling lighter than I had in months. I'm saying that Victoria has gotten exactly what she demanded. Legal ownership of Villa San Lorenzo, complete with all the financial obligations that come with such a generous gift. I pulled out my calculator and began adding numbers with the precision of someone who'd been managing these costs for 4 decades. Let's see. Property taxes, $48,000 annually. Insurance, $36,000. Maintenance, $120,000 on average. That comes to €204,000 per year in basic ownership costs, or roughly €17,000 per month. Victoria's face had gone completely white. €17,000 per month? That's the minimum, I confirmed cheerfully. Some months are higher when major repairs are needed. And of course, these figures don't include utilities, groundskeeping, or the salary for Maria, who's been our housekeeper for 12 years. I've promised her continued employment regardless of ownership changes. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the expression of dawning horror on Victoria's face. Livery, chi. The beautiful thing about Italian property law, I continued, is that once ownership is transferred, these obligations transfer with it, immediately. In fact, the first quarterly property tax payment is due next week. That'll be €12,000, payable to the municipal tax office in San Gimignano. Victoria's hands were shaking so violently now that she dropped the deed, the official papers scattering across the table like autumn leaves. But we don't have that kind of money, she whispered. How could we possibly afford €17,000 every month? An excellent question, I replied. Perhaps you should have asked it before demanding that I transfer the property to you. Marco was staring at his wife with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Victoria, did you research any of this before pushing for the transfer? She turned to him with wild eyes. How was I supposed to know about Italian heritage laws and property taxes? You assumed, I said quietly, that ownership of something beautiful came without cost. You assumed that 40 years of my life's work could simply be handed over without considering what it takes to maintain something truly valuable. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Victoria's rapid breathing and the distant chirping of birds in Isabella's garden. Of course, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket for one final document. There is a solution to this predicament. Victoria looked up with desperate hope. What solution? I placed a single sheet of paper on the table between us. This is a deed transfer reversal form. If you sign it within 72 hours of the original transfer, ownership reverts to the previous owner with no legal complications. She grabbed for the document like a drowning woman reaching for a life preserver. However, I continued, my voice taking on a harder edge, signing this form means acknowledging that you attempted to manipulate an elderly man into giving you property worth over €3 million without considering the responsibilities involved. It means admitting that your concern for Alessandro's future was actually greed disguised as maternal instinct. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, though whether from rage or shame I couldn't tell. And it means, I said, standing up from my chair with the dignity of a man who'd finally reclaimed his rightful place, that you'll never again treat me like a confused old fool whose only value is signing papers you put in front of him. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Outside, I could hear the sound of tourists laughing as they walked through the village square, normal people living normal lives without the weight of manipulation and betrayal hanging over their family gatherings. Marco spoke first, his voice quiet but firm. Victoria, sign the paper. She looked at him with shock. Marco, this is our chance to secure... Sign the paper, he repeated. We can't afford to own this place, and even if we could, we don't deserve it, not after what you've tried to do to my father. Victoria stared at the reversal form, her dreams of becoming lady of the manor crumbling like ancient mortar. The designer dress that had made her feel so powerful now seemed like a costume, a pretense that had finally been stripped away. With shaking hands, she picked up the pen I offered her and signed her name at the bottom of the document. Each letter seemed to cost her something, deflating her carefully constructed image of herself as someone entitled to other people's sacrifices. Excellent, I said, collecting all the papers and returning them to my manila envelope. The transfer is now null and void. Villa San Lorenzo remains in my name as it should be. I walked to the window and looked out at the olive grove, where Isabella and I had walked every evening for 20 years, discussing our dreams and plans for this place we'd built together. "Victoria," I said without turning around, "you're welcome to visit Alessandro here whenever Marco brings him. But you'll never again be welcome to stay overnight, and you'll never again have any voice in decisions about this property." Behind me, I heard the sound of crying, though I wasn't sure if it was Victoria's tears of frustration or Alessandro's confusion at the tension filling the room. Furthermore," I continued, "the financial support I've been providing for your family ends today. The mortgage payments, the credit card bills, the private school fees. You're adults. It's time you learn to support yourselves." Marco stood up, lifting Alessandro from his crib. "Papa, you're right. We should have been managing our own finances from the beginning." I turned to face my son, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The man who'd been hiding behind his wife's demands, who'd forgotten how to stand up for what was right. "Can you do that, Marco? Can you be the man your mother and I raised you to be?" He nodded, his jaw set with determination I hadn't seen since he was young. "Yes, we'll figure it out. We should have figured it out years ago." Victoria was sobbing now, mascara streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her carefully orchestrated manipulation had not only failed, but had cost her everything she'd been trying to secure. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "We're family. Family should help each other." I walked over to where she sat hunched in her chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "You're absolutely right, Victoria. Family should help each other. Family should also respect each other, appreciate each other's sacrifices, and never try to manipulate each other into giving up their life's work." I placed my hand gently on Alessandro's head as Marco held him. My grandson looked up at me with Isabella's eyes, innocent and trusting. "Alessandro will always have a place here," I said firmly. "This villa will be his inheritance someday, when he's old enough to understand what it means and what it costs to maintain something truly valuable. But he'll earn that inheritance through love and respect, not through his mother's scheming." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the windows, casting long shadows across the dining room where so many family celebrations had taken place over the years. Today had been a different kind of celebration, though Victoria would never see it that way. She'd gotten exactly what she'd demanded, the deed to my villa, and discovered that sometimes getting what you want is the worst thing that can happen to you. The days following Victoria's humiliation passed with a strange new rhythm. Where once I'd wake to the sound of her voice drifting up from the kitchen, demanding this or planning that, now there was only the gentle whisper of wind through olive branches and the distant church bells marking the hours in the village below. Marco had taken Victoria and Alessandro back to Florence that same evening, her designer luggage stuffed hastily into their rental car while she avoided meeting my eyes. The silence that followed their departure felt like drawing a deep breath after holding it for 3 years. I found myself rediscovering corners of my own home that had been claimed by Victoria's presence. The morning room where she'd conducted her endless phone calls with interior designers was mine again. The terrace where she'd sketched her renovation plans now held only my coffee cup and yesterday's newspaper. Even Isabella's garden seemed to exhale with relief, the surviving lavender plants straightening their purple spears toward the Tuscan sun. But peace, I was learning, came with its own complications. The first phone call arrived on Tuesday morning while I was pruning the rose bushes Isabella had loved so much. Marco's voice carried across the garden through my mobile phone, strained with the kind of exhaustion that comes from 3 days of non-stop arguments. "Papa, we need to talk about the financial situation. She's not handling this transition well." I set down my pruning shears and walked to the stone bench where Isabella used to sit while I worked. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son was calling to discuss money problems while surrounded by the evidence of how his father's money had been supporting them all along. "What specifically is the problem, Marco?" A long pause, filled with the distant sound of traffic in Florence. "Without your help with the mortgage, we can't make next month's payment. Victoria's talking about selling her jewelry, but even that won't cover what we owe." The mortgage I'd been paying for 2 years, while Victoria redecorated their apartment with my credit cards and planned her takeover of my villa. The bitter satisfaction of being proven right was tempered by genuine concern for my grandson's welfare. "And what does Victoria suggest as a solution?" Another pause, longer this time. "She wants me to ask you to reconsider. She thinks maybe there was some misunderstanding about her intentions regarding the villa." I almost laughed. Victoria's intentions had been crystal clear from the moment she'd cornered me on the terrace, demanding I sign over my life's work like it was some overdue paperwork she was helping me organize. Marco, there was no misunderstanding. Your wife attempted to manipulate me into giving her property worth over 3 million euros, and when I gave her exactly what she asked for, she discovered she couldn't afford the responsibilities that come with such a gift. I know, Papa. I know what she did was wrong. But Alessandro needs stability, and if we lose the apartment, the child. Always the child used as leverage, as if my love for my grandson somehow obligated me to fund his parents' poor financial decisions indefinitely. Alessandro needs parents who can support themselves, I said firmly. Parents who understand the difference between asking for help and demanding inheritance while the person they're inheriting from is still alive. Through the phone, I could hear Victoria's voice in the background, sharp with desperation, though I couldn't make out the words. She's scared, Papa. We both are. Neither of us has ever had to manage money this carefully before. Because I'd been managing it for them, I thought, but didn't say. Because every time they'd faced a financial challenge, they'd turned to Roberto's generosity instead of learning to solve problems themselves. Fear can be an excellent teacher, I said. Your mother and I were terrified when we bought this villa's ruins 40 years ago. We had no idea how we'd afford the restoration, but we figured it out through hard work and sacrifice. Times were different then. Human nature wasn't. People still had to earn what they wanted instead of expecting it to be handed to them. The conversation ended with Marco promising to call again once they'd had time to explore their options. I knew what those options were: sell the Florence apartment, find something they could actually afford, and learn to live within their means like millions of other families manage to do every day. But Victoria's next move surprised even me. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my door. Giuliano Rossi's secretary had called that morning to warn me, but seeing Victoria's mother standing on my doorstep still sent a shock through my system like ice water. Catherine Pemberton Wells had flown from London specifically to intervene in what she clearly saw as an Italian peasant's rebellion against her daughter's rightful claims. At 68, she carried herself with the kind of imperial bearing that assumed doors would open and problems would solve themselves through the sheer force of her displeasure. Mr. Flores, she said in clipped English tones, we need to discuss this unfortunate situation with Victoria. I stepped aside to let her enter, curious to see how far the apple had fallen from this particular tree. She swept into my entrance hall with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon of social warfare. Please, sit down, I offered, gesturing toward the living room where Isabella's carefully chosen furniture created an atmosphere of understated elegance. Catherine perched on the edge of an antique chair, as if contact with my possessions might somehow contaminate her breeding. I'll be direct, Mr. Flores. My daughter made certain assumptions about your willingness to provide for her family's security. Perhaps those assumptions were premature, but they weren't unreasonable given the circumstances. I wondered if she meant my age, my widowhood, or simply the fact that her daughter had married an Italian and therefore expected continental generosity to flow like wine at a wedding. What exactly did Victoria tell you about our conversation? Catherine's mouth tightened with the kind of displeasure that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being questioned. She explained that you'd agreed to transfer the villa for Alessandro's benefit, then changed your mind out of some petty desire to maintain control over property that will eventually belong to the family anyway. The revision of history was breathtaking. In Victoria's version of events, I'd apparently become the villain who'd promised generosity, then snatched it away out of spite. Did she mention demanding that I move to a small apartment in the village so she could take over my home immediately? A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or embarrassment, crossed Catherine's features. Victoria may have been enthusiastic in her suggestions about your living arrangements, but surely you understand that a property of this size requires younger management. Younger management. As if 40 years of successfully maintaining this villa had somehow disqualified me from continuing to do so. Mrs. Pemberton Wells, your daughter didn't request help with management. She demanded complete ownership. When I granted her request, she discovered that owning something valuable requires more than simply wanting it. I pulled out the folder containing the property tax assessments and maintenance records, spreading them across the coffee table between us. Catherine glanced at the numbers with the kind of disdain that suggested arithmetic was beneath her social station. These figures are clearly inflated, she said dismissively. I'm sure with proper negotiation, these costs could be significantly reduced. Which costs would you negotiate? The property taxes set by the Italian government, the insurance premiums mandated by heritage protection laws, the structural maintenance required to prevent a building this old from falling down. For the first time since arriving, Catherine looked uncertain. The confidence that came from a lifetime of having other people solve her problems was meeting the reality of Italian bureaucracy and physics. Surely there are accommodations that can be made for family circumstances. I almost felt sorry for her. This woman had spent decades believing that the right connections and sufficient indignation could overcome any inconvenience, including the laws of mathematics and structural engineering. Mrs. Pemberton Wells, let me explain something about Italian property ownership. When you own a villa like this, you don't negotiate with gravity. You don't bargain with roof tiles that need replacement or foundation stones that require repair. You either pay the costs of ownership or you lose the property to decay and taxation. She stared at the maintenance records as if they were written in a foreign language, which, in a sense, they were. The language of actual responsibility, actual consequences, actual work required to maintain something beautiful. There must be some arrangement we can reach, she said finally, her imperial tone cracking slightly. Victoria has made certain commitments based on expectations that you encouraged. What commitments? Catherine's hands twisted around her handbag strap. She's already spoken with contractors about renovations. Deposits have been paid for new furniture, design consultations, landscaping plans. If you refuse to honor the transfer, she'll lose thousands of pounds. The audacity was staggering. Victoria had been so confident of manipulating me into signing over my property that she'd started spending money she didn't have on changes I'd never approved to a home she didn't yet own. How much has she committed? Nearly £30,000, money she borrowed against the expectation of your generosity. I leaned back in Isabella's favorite chair, trying to process the magnitude of Victoria's presumption. She'd mortgaged her future against my assumed weakness, bet everything on her ability to guilt me into surrendering my life's work. Mrs. Pemberton Wells, your daughter gambled with money she didn't have on property she didn't own, based on manipulating a man she clearly doesn't understand. That's not my responsibility to fix. Catherine's composure finally cracked. She's my daughter. She's made mistakes, yes, but she's family. Surely that counts for something. Family counts for everything, I said quietly, which is why I spent 2 years paying their mortgage, covering their credit card bills, and supporting their lifestyle, while Victoria planned to warehouse me in some village apartment so she could play lady of the manor in my home. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of truths that couldn't be argued away. Through the windows, I could see the olive grove where Isabella and I had walked every evening, planning our future and building something that would last beyond our own lives. What will it take? Catherine asked finally, her voice smaller than when she'd arrived. What would you accept to help Victoria out of this situation? I studied this woman who'd raised a daughter to believe that charm and manipulation were acceptable substitutes for honesty and hard work. The answer I was about to give would shock her more than Victoria's property tax bills. Nothing, I said simply. I will accept nothing, because there's nothing Victoria can offer that would undo what she tried to do to me. Catherine's mouth fell open. Nothing? But surely, money means nothing to someone your age. What good does it do you to see your own family struggle? My family isn't struggling. My son is learning to support himself like an adult. My grandson will inherit something meaningful when he's old enough to appreciate it. And my daughter-in-law is discovering that actions have consequences. I stood up, the conversation clearly over. Catherine remained seated, staring at me as if I'd spoken in tongues. Victoria will figure out her financial problems the same way millions of other people do, through work, sacrifice, and living within her means. Skills she should have learned years ago. You're a cruel man, Catherine said, rising from her chair with wounded dignity. I'm a man who spent 40 years building something beautiful and won't watch it be destroyed by someone who sees it only as an asset to be claimed. After she left, I walked through my villa with fresh eyes, seeing it as Catherine and Victoria saw it, not as a home filled with memories, but as valuable property that should somehow belong to them simply because they wanted it. The difference was that I'd earned the right to see it both ways. I'd laid every stone, planted every tree, paid every bill that had transformed this place from ruin to paradise. Victoria saw only the paradise and assumed it came without cost. That evening, I called Marco. Your mother-in-law paid me a visit today. sharp intake of breath. Papa, I had no idea she was coming. Victoria called her without telling me. She informed me that Victoria has borrowed £30,000 against the expectation that I'd give her my villa. Silence, then quietly, I didn't know about the borrowing. What did you know about? Another pause. I knew she was confident. I knew she'd started making plans. I should have stopped her, but she was so sure you'd agree that I started believing it myself. The honesty in his voice gave me hope. Perhaps some part of the son I'd raised was still there, buried under years of Victoria's influence. Marco, your wife is going to lose £30,000 because she gambled on manipulating me. That's her choice and her consequence, but I want you to understand something clearly. Yes, Papa. This villa will be Alessandro's inheritance someday. When he's old enough to understand its value, old enough to take responsibility for its care, old enough to appreciate the sacrifice it represents. But that inheritance comes with conditions. I walked to the window overlooking Isabella's garden, where new growth was already emerging from the damaged lavender plants Victoria had destroyed. He must earn it through love and respect, not through his mother's schemes. He must understand that beautiful things require work to maintain, and he must never, ever treat family the way his mother treated me. I understand, Papa, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I let things go this far. Then prove it. Take care of your own family without expecting me to solve your problems. Show Alessandro what it means to be a man who takes responsibility for his choices. The conversation ended with promises and apologies that might or might not prove meaningful over time. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was talking to my son rather than Victoria's messenger. Over the following weeks, updates arrived sporadically. Victoria had indeed lost the £30,000 she'd borrowed, plus additional penalties for canceling contracts she'd signed prematurely. They'd put their Florence apartment on the market and were looking at smaller places they could actually afford. Marco had started working longer hours, taking on additional projects his architecture firm offered. For the first time since his marriage, he was actively trying to increase his income rather than simply managing the money I provided. And Victoria? Victoria had taken a job, part-time at first, helping a friend with her interior design business, but work nonetheless. The woman who'd demanded a €3 million villa was learning to earn money one consultation at a time. The irony was perfect. In trying to claim my life's work without effort, Victoria had been forced to discover the value of actual work. In attempting to live off my success, she'd been compelled to create some success of her own. Justice, I was learning, didn't always arrive with thunderbolts and dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of people finally learning lessons they should have absorbed years earlier. I spent my mornings tending Isabella's garden, my afternoons maintaining the villa that would someday belong to Alessandro, and my evenings watching the sun set over hills that had witnessed 40 years of my labor and love. The peace I'd fought for was deeper than the absence of Victoria's demands. It was the peace that came from knowing I'd defended something worth defending, from refusing to let manipulation triumph over dignity, from teaching my family that some things in life must be earned rather than simply claimed. The villa still needed work, still required constant attention and considerable expense, but now those responsibilities belonged to someone who understood their value, someone who'd paid the price of creating something beautiful rather than merely inheriting it. Victoria had wanted the deed to my villa, and in the most technical sense, she'd received it. For approximately 48 hours, she'd owned one of Tuscany's most beautiful properties, complete with all the crushing financial obligations that made such beauty possible. It was the most expensive education she'd ever received, and probably the most valuable. Whether she'd learned anything from it remained to be seen. But I suspected that somewhere in Florence, in a smaller apartment than she'd planned to live in, Victoria was discovering something her privileged upbringing had never taught her. That the most meaningful things in life can't be taken or demanded or manipulated into existence. They can only be built one stone at a time through love and patience and the kind of work that leaves calluses on your hands and satisfaction in your heart. The final lesson came 6 months later, delivered not through confrontation or legal documents, but through a simple phone call that changed everything. I was in the olive grove checking the trees before harvest season when Marco's voice reached me across the afternoon stillness. His tone was different somehow, carrying a weight I hadn't heard since Isabella's final days. "Papa, we need to talk. Victoria and I, We're getting divorced. I set down my pruning shears and walked to the stone wall where my phone got better reception. The September air carried the scent of ripening grapes and the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. What happened, son? A long exhale crackled through the speaker. She never forgave you for teaching her that lesson about the villa, but more than that, she never forgave me for not taking her side against you. The resentment it poisoned everything between us. Through the grove, I could see the villa's terracotta roof tiles glowing in the afternoon sun, each one a reminder of the work required to maintain something lasting. Victoria had wanted the beauty without understanding the foundation beneath it. And Alessandro? He'll stay with me. Victoria's moving back to London, starting fresh with her mother's help. She says Italy never felt like home anyway. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd demanded my Italian villa as her inheritance was abandoning Italy entirely, choosing the familiar comfort of her mother's world over the challenging reality of building something herself. I'm sorry it came to this, Marco. I'm not. His voice carried a strength I hadn't heard in years. For the first time since we married, I feel like I can breathe, like I can make decisions based on what's right instead of what keeps Victoria happy. That evening, as sunset painted the Tuscan hills gold and purple, I walked through every room of the villa with new eyes. Not the calculating gaze Victoria had used, measuring square footage and market value, but the satisfied inspection of someone who'd created something meaningful and protected it when protection was needed. In the dining room where I'd revealed the true cost of ownership, Isabella's portrait watched from above the sideboard, her smile seeming to approve of how the story had unfolded. She'd always said that people revealed their true character when faced with responsibility they hadn't expected. Victoria had revealed herself completely that afternoon, and the revelation had cost her everything she'd thought she wanted. But perhaps that was the real gift I'd given her, though she'd never see it that way. The gift of consequences, of learning that beauty and value come with prices that must be paid in more than money. They require character, commitment, and the kind of love that builds rather than simply takes. My phone buzzed with a text from Marco. Alessandro wants to know if he can help with the olive harvest next month. He's been asking about Nonno's trees. I smiled, typing back my response. Tell him we'll start teaching him the old ways. Every tree has its own personality. He'll need to learn them all. Some inheritances, I thought, are worth the wait, and some lessons are worth teaching, no matter how much they cost the people who need to learn them. The villa settled into evening quiet around me, its stones holding the warmth of another day, its foundations secure for another generation. Victoria had gotten exactly what she'd demanded, and in losing it, had given us all something far more valuable. The truth about what really matters and who we really are when everything else is stripped away.